From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. This is a program about regenerative agriculture and the many different paths people are taking to fix our broken food system, restore soil, and mitigate climate change. And on today's program, we're going to be talking about a concept that may be new to many of our listeners, and that is the idea of de-commodifying land. We'll get into that right after these announcements. This program is sponsored by the Agrarian Trust. Agrarian Trust is charting a new path forward for the land trust movement. They're advancing an innovative and robust model of land ownership in which agrarianism, social and environmental justice, community well-being, and the earth itself are seen as fundamentally intertwined. They're doing this by helping regenerative farmers and ranchers to secure long-term, affordable land leases. That helps to strengthen local food systems and to transform community relationships to the land across the country. Visit agrariantrust.org to learn more. This program is sponsored by the Greenhorns. Listeners to Down to Earth might enjoy the newly released 6th edition of the New Farmer's Almanac, a literary miscellany written by and for working agrarians. This year's volume is called Adjustments and Accommodations, and it's full of essays, poetry, and images that explore how people are facing challenges and uncertainties on the land. Learn more and order your copy at greenhorns.org. And one more announcement. The Colorado Coalition to Enhance Working Land's annual summit is taking place on March 23rd in Denver, Colorado, co-hosted by Colorado State University's Soil Carbon Solutions Center. This will be a free day-long event where folks can continue sharing, building, and strengthening our networks, practices, and communication. You can register at the website cocewl.org. And now to our program. I'd like to welcome Neil Thapar and Mariela Cedeño. Neil is a land justice attorney, and he's co-director at Minnow, where he directs their program of land and financial redistribution. Mariela Cedeño has a long history of cultivating local economies, resilient food systems, and equitable economic opportunities. She is a partner in Manzanita Capital Collective, and they're both co-founders of the People's Land Fund. Welcome to Down to Earth.
Thanks. Nice being here.
Thanks for having us.
So both of you spoke at the Regenerate conference, and you talked about a topic that, as Neil said, may challenge the inner capitalist in all of us, and that is thinking about land not as a commodity, but as a living, life-giving being to be stewarded. How did each of you come to this work?
That's right, the little capitalist. Well, it's a not straightforward path, I think, for someone with legal training to come to realize that the legal underpinnings of our economy and our land system are false. But I was brought here by a combination of coming to some understanding of why I've always felt like my identity straddles multiple places. So I'm a child of immigrants and my parents came from India. I lived there for a while when I was younger. And so I felt at home in both places and also not at home in both places for different reasons. And I think just that experience and reconciling that experience and understanding it as I grew up helped me realize, and both understanding colonization as it happened for my parents' homelands, and then understanding how it happened here, the place where I was born and call home, helped me rethink what the relationship is that we have to land through the lens of how we're told the story growing up in the United States and going to school here, with the stories and experience that I've come to learn from both professional and personal relationships that I've had. So that's the broad strokes of kind of how I've conceptually come here.
Yeah, I think similarly, I'll share just background. I was born in Venezuela in South America, moved to the States when I was around 10. And I think, originally had, as a kiddo, had aspirations of like finding ways to reconnect and support Latin American economic development, and quickly realized that the ways that I could do that kind of through US entities was not aligned with my values. So I started thinking about what I could do in my own backyard that felt doable and felt like impact that I could actually support. And so specific to food, that kind of journey took me to working in legal aid with farm workers. I worked with indigenous dairy farmers in Bolivia, specifically around microlending. Ended up here back in the Bay Area doing work around access to markets for Black, Indigenous, and POC farmers. And I think, what I'll share through all of that and kind of this reconciling of my maybe academic training in economics and also the reality of food and food labor and land and all these things was that it's just not viable in the way that the capital system wants it to be. It's viable in the way that we can think about community and feeding ourselves and having quality life. And so I think that's kind of how I've gotten here and landed in this kind of space that I think Neil and I share around the realities of food economics and how we think about land today in the system.
Neil, I was wondering if you could talk about land in the Western United States, which is really only a few generations away from its original long-term Indigenous stewardship. How did Native people in the places that you've lived and work, how did they regard the land? How's that different from what happened when it was confiscated by the United States?
That's a probably deeper question that I think I'm qualified to answer, but I think I can share what I've come to learn from my own study and also from being in some conversations with some Indigenous people in some parts of the Western United States. And I say all those qualifiers because I don't think there's one story that there is to tell about that. But my understanding and the way that I internalize it and sort of like move forward in my work is understanding, just a fundamentally different relationship between human existence and the surrounding environment, land, air, water, and non-human species. And there's a fluidity in the relationship and a connectedness in the relationship pre-contact that is destroyed really by a Western framework that really separates people from the environment around it. And I think that separation is foundational to understanding how we think of land in an economic context and how we think of land in a legal context as this abstract commodity that can be traded one for one anywhere in the world based on the dollar value that we give it, when in fact each piece of land, I think inherently people understand that each place is unique and is different. And you ask anybody who goes to some area, natural area that's special to them, and you ask them why it's special, and they'll give you a reason why it's different than every other place. And some place is special to every person. And so if we extrapolate that out, we can see how that separation of people from the lands that they're on is so fundamental to why we have the current system and why it works for the status quo from the very different, from at least what I understand, again, my limited understanding of what I think Indigenous relationships to land look like.
And part of that is just things as simple as not building in floodplains and not building in tidal areas and in forests that have a natural burn cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that separation also comes from and feeds into a sort of sense of dominance that humans have over the landscape, that we can alter landscapes to our liking rather than understanding of ourselves as part of an ecosystem, and that if we make irreparable changes to one part of that ecosystem, that it'll have ripple effects for generations to come. And you and I were talking a little bit about the recent flooding in the Salinas Valley as a result of all the heavy storms at the end of the year. And I was reflecting on that very question. I think you can point to other examples like you did about fire, about coastal erosion, that are putting people at risk currently because there was at some point in the recent past a notion that we could do whatever we want with the landscape and it'll adapt to us, forgetting that it's always been the other way around, that we have always had to adapt to our surroundings.
Mariela, you and I were talking the other day about New Mexico, which is where I am, and how during the wildfires last summer, land burned differently depending on how it was stewarded.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just specific to New Mexico, and, this is definitely not my expertise. I'm not an Indigenous land steward myself, but I think in my experience in working with farmers and land stewards, whether that be folks that we might think more commercial farmers or folks who are just thinking about nature and ecological stewardship of the land and or folks who are thinking about reclamation, is that this concept of how to take care of the land always comes up. Because either, benefit of the business, benefit of the planet, benefit of generations to come. And I think with the fires specifically, what's come up for me is that, in some of the work that we're doing in New Mexico is that when folks are not connected to the land and natural disaster comes as it comes, the stewardship prior to it coming is really important. What I'm hearing from folks that we're working with tribal folks, is how much they think about stewardship of the land and connections to those natural disasters, both in the context that Neil shared, like things that will happen and how to prepare the land for it happening, and things that don't need to happen in the way that they're happening, and preparing the land for that not to happen. And I think just want to plug in back into what Neil shared is that comes up in the sense of all natural occurrences that happen in our planet. Fires are a good example, as are floods, as are coastal erosion, and all the other things that y'all have talked about.
I want to talk about de-commodification and what that means, but let's talk first about the very concept of commodity. I mean, when we think of commodities, we think of corn or railroad cars or computer chips or whatever, these things that are sort of fungible that can be bought and sold, and that, or a gallon of gasoline. It really doesn't matter which gallon of gasoline, they're all kind of alike. And I remember reading that book. I don't know if you ever read that book called The Third Plate, but it was so interesting because it was a chef talking about how flour didn't used to be a commodity because it was fresh and it was perishable. And it was only when the living nature of flour got killed that it could be put into these gigantic bags and packed onto railroad cars and shipped somewhere. And of course, the bread and cakes that you make with it isn't as good and isn't as healthy as flour that's real. I don't even know if you can, there's probably not very many places you can get that, but some people are milling their own. But when you start talking about land as a commodity, what is that mentality in the first place? I mean, one of the things that's just viscerally painful to me is the idea of these private equity companies and corporations buying up farmland to fit into a portfolio as opposed to being habitat or ecosystems or something that's able to, feed people. But talk first about this process of commodification of land. It didn't happen overnight exactly, or maybe it did.
Yeah, I think you could probably do another podcast episode on the commodification of land in the U.S. context, and that would be a really interesting conversation to have. So we probably don't need to go into the full depths there, but I think suffice to say, in the grand scheme of time, it seems like to me that it did happen pretty much overnight. And what's really amazing to me when I think about this work is not just how fast it happened, but really how fast the cultural norms and understanding of land shifted, such that I could probably point back 2 generations in my own family and try to have a conversation and explain to them how people trade and buy and sell land, and they would have a hard time understanding what I'm talking about. And there's obviously millions of people alive today who are part of this current generation who still would have a hard time understanding that cultural norm. But to someone like me who grew up in the US, I never thought twice about it. Really, it's just so much part of our basic understanding of how things are. And there's not a lot of room to try to think about how they might otherwise be. That's a function of our economic and social system and political system, I think, is to keep us thinking about how things are, that they're the only way that they can be. It's interesting, Western economic thought previously would break things out into factors of production, these terms, right? Land, labor, capital. Land and capital were separate in economic thought for a long time. And recently, like in the last 150 years or so, capital and land have kind of merged in dominant economic thought because of this notion of the fungibility of land, the same way that you could trade a railroad car and one is the same as the other. Now, the way our financial system works is it thinks about land just as that what land in western Colorado is the same as southern Florida. And as long as it's appraised at the same value, you can just swap the two financially, for example. But that smoothing out and that eliminating of the uniqueness of the fact that South Florida, there's a particular context in which that land exists, and there's wetlands or there's some species that are, endemic to that area, and the same for Western Colorado, is completely lost in our financial system, and it's intended to be lost so that it can fit into this box of how we can monetize basically our land relations. It's through this lens of ownership and sale and speculation. And those are the underpinnings that allow for the kind of speculation and private investment that you're talking about that are so painful for you to see, is that especially after the 2008 recession, we saw so much more investment shift from the stock market, which was seen as too risky at the time, and people starting to pour money into land. And that's only accelerated since then. And we've all heard now who the largest farmland owner is in the country, Bill Gates. And it's not because he is this amazing conservationist, which he might be, but it's because it's a safe investment that his financial advisors tell him that it's a safe investment. It's the most likely to be the most profitable, because as long as land is financialized and there's a finite amount of it, then its value is going to increase over time, because development is going to continue, that pressure is going to continue. And so that land is going to become more valuable. And so it becomes a safe financial investment. So Bill Gates is investing in it. Pension funds are investing in it. There's a lot of kind of xenophobic, like other countries are investing in American farmland that happens as well, which is concerning, not more concerning necessarily than Bill Gates investing in the farmland, to me at least. But those are the new pressures or newer pressures on agricultural lands, on rural lands, and the rise of what's called non-operating landowners, people who don't have any direct ties to the land but are instead just silent or invisible investors, that all contribute to this really intense pressure on farmland or agricultural land right now.
I think that part of what is, the crux of the matter there, because, the same thing is happening in cities. Corporations and private equity and so on are buying up single-family houses in the city where I live and in many cities, and those houses are no longer available to single families. They become Airbnbs, or they become more luxurious than the neighborhood. And same thing with farmland. It's like that farmland doesn't become available to farmers. And one can imagine that we might not be having this conversation if small and mid-sized farmers were able to afford land and they bought and sold land in a kind of reasonable way that was about actually farming and stewarding the land. But instead we have this situation which drives us to have conversations about de-commodification. And I wanted to ask you, what does it actually mean in a practical sense to de-commodify land? Like, what does that look like in reality? What kind of tools are you using? What would you like to see?
I think the lens maybe that I would add to the idea of land becoming a commodity is actually how it's been valued and how that value has increased over time. So there's first the concept that we're even putting a production value on land, right? So like the value of land being based on how much it produces. Then there's the kind of movement into what Neil was talking about in the sense of like a stock market for land, like a fungible asset that can be moved and can be increased and can be done whatever based on a kind of gold rush principle. And then there's the third piece that we were talking about, which is now a romanticized version of land, which are folks who just want to have land, whether that's kind of like Bill Gates under a conservation type lens, TBD whether that's true, or it's just somebody who lives in a city and wants to have a beautiful farmland scenery to wake up to 1 week a year. And so I first think about that first step, which was putting a value on land tied to production. And then where we are now, which is a ceilingless amount of increased appreciation of value on land. And so I think on one end of the spectrum, I think about this idea of de-commodifying land on the spectrum, both from the lens of maybe a more traditional and still within the capitalist context of small, primarily Black, Indigenous, and POC farmers.
And POC, ladies and gentlemen, people of color.
People of color, yeah, who have commercial businesses, right? They're producing food for us, but it's also part of their economic livelihood. And the huge gap that there is between what they can do to get us food, sustain themselves, and also not extract more from the land, right? And that has a cap just from like an economic space versus the ever increasing price of land. So on one side of the spectrum, even farmers that have viable businesses that are taking care of our food needs of the planet and of their own livelihood, they can never produce enough to keep up with the rising cost of land. And so part of the work of de-commodifying is figuring out what can they hold within the current system versus what's that gap between what they can do and where the market's at to get it out of that market, right? So functionally, what that has looked like in our work is that we're looking at, okay, if it's a $10, for simplify it, like piece of property, and we know that the business can produce like $6 of that worth or that value that's been put on it, how do we get at the other $4? And in a way that doesn't continue to extract. And so that's where we're looking for philanthropic resources. We're looking for non-extractive capital investments, like things that are not ideal and still within this capitalist ecosystem, but allow farmers to get access to land. We continue to be fed. Folks are stewarding the land. And on the other side of the spectrum, we're really talking about rematriation and return of land, collective land access, indigenous land reclamation. Practically what that looks like is that in an ideal world, it's that folks are really, landowners are looking at themselves and aligning their values with the world they want to see, and they're returning that land to stewards. That's one way, and I think that's like the ideal way. Another kind of avenue that we work on is figuring out how do we buy the land? How do we buy land to put it back into stewardship? And in a way that doesn't put more debt or more pressure on that land, that allows folks to just steward the land, which comes, frankly, with costs in itself, right? So they are doing that for the public interest as well. And so in that space, we're really looking at philanthropic capital, like dollars that will not be repaid. And within the context not of charity, but within the context of shifting power and capital to land stewardship. And that also could be like a whole nother podcast, which is where does wealth in America come from? And like, why do some folks have it and other folks don't? So I think, I see this as an ideal, which is reclamation and return of land. And then a bunch of different ways of figuring out within the current system, how do we get to that ideal? And I think the last thing I was going to add to, just in the sense of like how we've seen land commodified, is that it's crazy to me. I think about this a lot too, about how just growing up in the US and the things that you just don't question, but thinking of things that are really public interest. Like it's of public interest to me as an individual or as part of a community to have clean air, water, and shelter and food. And so when we think about land, it's not to our interest to have land be commodity. It's not to our interest to have food be a commodity. I don't think it's to our interest to have anything really be a commodity, but I think that there are some basic things that are really like anti the way that we should function. So I think within that ecosystem, there's a lot of ways to get to the end. And I think this is the kind of thing that, Neil, myself, and lots of other folks across the country are trying to figure out is there's a reality that we're within the system, right? And we're trying to build a different system. And there's lots of ways to get to that different system, practical ways, and also like ideal ways that we are seeing become practical realities.
So let's talk about some of those in actual existence, like returning land to original land stewards. There have been pieces of public land and private land also that has been returned to tribes.
Yeah, that's been happening for longer than I probably know, but I think most recently, at least in my journey, the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline and the water protectors and Standing Rock brought to the fore again for the general public this question about what does indigenous sovereignty mean in the United States. And I think flowing from that has been a whole lot of energy and sort of relearning and unlearning and shifting of our cultural narrative about the role of sovereignty as it relates to indigenous communities throughout the United States. And I think that has catapulted and accelerated what people call the Land Back campaign, which as a hashtag is relatively new, but as a call to action is not new at all.
Where's it actually happening?
It's happening all over the country, from Nebraska to Maine to... There's probably land back happening in every state and territory of the United States. I wouldn't be surprised. Where it's happening for us in California is, one of the projects that we get to work on is to help facilitate the return of ancestral land for 3 tribes up in Mendocino County from the state of California. And this is deriving from kind of executive order by the governor after a lot of pressure from indigenous communities to finally started with an apology for the genocide of indigenous peoples that created the state of California, and then followed up with this executive order to have all state agencies inventory the lands that they own, which is significant throughout the state, and classify certain lands as excess lands, which they don't need for their agency's function, and to prioritize either returning those lands to tribes or engaging in some kind of co-management and co-governance of those lands. The parcel that we're working on, the tribes have been in conversation with the agency that owns that is Caltrans, State Transportation Agency, since at least 2005. The lessons that we're learning and the takeaways that I have to share about this work, which is still ongoing, is just, again, how long it takes, even when a decision is made or there's an openness to transfer land, coming up on almost 20 years of being in conversation about just this one parcel of land in a territory of tribes that encompasses many counties. And even when there's legislation, as in this case, which was passed to authorize the transfer from the state agency to the tribes, the many, shall we say, gaps between the understanding of how this process should take place between the state agency, which sees itself as doing something in advancing land equity and repair, with the tribe's understanding of how this transfer should take place and what role they should have in the process of determining each of the steps to make the process equitable and not just focus on the end goal of, okay, well, you received the land, so be happy with the fact that we gave you the land. Don't worry about how we get it to you. And that's been a lot of the work that I've been doing, is to try to help translate the very bureaucratic processes to tribes in a way where they feel like there's agency and there is equity and a peer-to-peer relationship between the tribes and state agencies, which there ought to be since they're sovereign nations. But there's a history of paternalism between the United States and Native American nations. And so we're trying to mitigate that so that the transfer goes through to the benefit and setting the tribes up for success in how they're going to manage this property, which is going to be preserved in the way that it currently exists, where there are cultural resources, where there are fishing resources, where there'll be opportunities for education, both for Native communities and for the general public as well. So I'm really excited about the project that I get to work on and for other opportunities to do more of this, because I think it's the way in which we're going to tell a different story. So people's imaginations are going to be sparked for what they can do in their communities.
So that's one example of a very lengthy, you guys have incredible patience process of transferring land from state ownership back to tribal stewardship or ownership or some kind of co-management, as you say. Another thing that people are doing is literally buying land and turning it over to other people. What does that look like? What are some examples of that in real life?
Yeah, I can share a bit about what that's looked like for us. We, as in the People's Land Fund, which is a collaborative organization that Neil, Minnow, and myself, the Manzanita, and other members belong to, The People's Land Fund, one of the projects that we took on to support farmers accessing land was here in California in the Central Coast in a town called Watsonville. That's very well known for agriculture and farmland. Many of the farmers that we work with are based in that area in the Central Coast: Watsonville, Salinas, Hollister, Castroville. And this specific property located in Watsonville was kind of prime for many reasons. One of them being is that it was organic certified, had lots of water access, road access, and also had been actively in production. So the land was kind of ready to go. And in that example, what I would share is the property was almost 13 million. It was a big swath of property and property that was very wanted in that area. It was an off-market transaction, which made it a lot easier to figure out together on a timeline that might be different in the conventional market, where land's on the market for a day or 14 days here in California. So those are some of the things that we had working for us. And basically what that work looked like was working with a group of farmers that will take over to steward the land and co-own the land, to figure out what could their businesses actually take on in the sense of what might look like a farmer mortgage loan. And so that was really viability analysis around their businesses, what they had done in the past, what they could do in the future, and then figuring out what the gap was between what they could afford and where the land was at. And that gap was about a $4.5 million gap. We were explicitly looking at investments that were non-extractive, which to us meant that they were 0% ideally, maybe 1% to 2% at most, that they were patient and met the needs of the farmers. And then for the other $4.5 million was grant funding and also some other revenue that could cover that gap. And so of a $12.5 million property, $8 million came through non-extractive investments. The other 4.5 came through a combination of grants, philanthropic grants, recoverable grants, that kind of infrastructure that wasn't going to be returned. So that's one example where there was a property, it was an off-market property, it was purchased, and the way that it was purchased was a mix of non-extractive loans and philanthropic grants.
So just for our listeners who've probably never heard of the idea of non-extractive investment, that means basically approaching an investor, and investors like to get return on their investment, saying, we want you to invest $1 million, let's say $1 million in this land. You'll get your $1 million back, but you won't get any more, or you might get 1 or 2% at most. What is that conversation like? Like the people whom you are approaching, what do they say? Why would I do that? Or I want to be part of the solution? Or what's going on there?
I mean, I think it depends. I'll share just a little bit more context. I mean, non-extraction, right? It's a mix of what you said, 0% return, ideally, and also terms that benefit the end user, the project, the borrower, instead of the investor. And that in the end, we are all looking towards the benefit of the project rather than the financial return of the investor, right? And that's both practical and philosophical as well, and it comes into play. I think the way that these conversations are had, it depends on the investor, but I'll just share a few things that have come up for me. One is obviously it has to be folks who are interested in some social impact, and also people who maybe are a little bit more aware about how their money was made, in the sense of reckoning with where money's coming from and whether or not they need to continue to make more money. I think that is a spectrum for folks, but those are some baselines. I think in the sense of interest, it also depends. I think that there's so much that is happening when land is stewarded by folks who really care about the land. And so that means that we are bringing up things that will happen on the land, which could be everything from food being produced to economic opportunity for farmers of color to ecological stewardship and whatever that might mean for different folks. And so investors are coming into this because they want to support one of those things, all of those things. And then I think some of the more dynamic conversations that happen within that, especially within the context of food and ecology, is that we've already devastated the planet, and food is already something that is barely making enough money for the people that are growing it for us. We understand that farm workers are underpaid, small farmers don't necessarily have viable incomes. There's a lot kind of in the economies of that. And so part of that is having a conversation with folks around, if your ultimate goal is ecological or food access or economic opportunity, those have to be the things that are central and that we can't continue to extract from those. Like there just isn't more room to extract from food. There isn't more room to extract from labor. There's not more room to extract from the land. And so it is a bit of a philosophical conversation around their values alignment and what they actually want to do versus what they've been told. Generally in the impact investment world, which is this idea that you can like do good and feel good and make lots of money. And that's not a real narrative. That's kind of like a washed narrative that investors who are trying to get more money to invest in like ESG stuff or have put into the air that just doesn't work for land. And then, then kind of you work back down to the conversation of like, what does that mean functionally, right? Which is where we started, like 0%, like paying back the principal, but not paying back interest. Like this isn't to the benefit of your financial interest, it's for the benefit of the folks who are actually storing the land for us, for like the collective us.
And keeping in mind that those same people, those same investors who might make a zero interest loan are also making money in high-tech investments and other things that are not land-based.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a whole huge other conversation. But even from private investors to institutional philanthropy, foundations only have to put 5% of their endowments out, through their philanthropic avenues. The other 95% is primarily functioning in conventional markets that, in fact, work against their values, giving or investment, right? So you have one hand that's 5% of the hand that might be putting money into ecological stewardship, food, land, and the other one that's like mining, fracking, polluting, doing lots of other things. So, I mean, that's like a bigger conversation to have. And also to your point, trying to humanize conversations with individual investors that like do want to do better is that the money, ideally we're working towards that percentage increasing. But in the climate that we have now, which is this minimum tax requirement of 5%, it doesn't functionally change their livelihoods in any way. It's not a huge dent in what they're doing. I mean, that's just true. But it's also not ideal, but that's for another day.
Well, I keep thinking about that quote from the poet Audre Lorde that says, "The master's tool will never dismantle the master's house." You could do a whole podcast on that conversation because there's a lot of subversion that happens, successful subversion that happens using the quote-unquote master's tools. But it's still tricky business because, I mean, we talk about people, planet, profit, and there's people, I've interviewed many small farmers who have adopted regenerative agriculture as a tool, and they've gotten out of these sort of toxic farm chemical ways of living and are looking at the land and really working with it in a way that is true to what that ecosystem is. And they're actually healthier, they're making more money, they've got better crops, they've got, more kind of insurance against flood and drought because of the way they're stewarding soil and things like that. But that kind of mentality of people, planet, profit does seem to make the most sense, at least as far as I can see, on small and mid-sized farms where you can make a good living, you can support your family, you can put some money away for retirement, but you're not going to be a mega zillionaire. And that's really the distinction we're looking at. And I imagine that the system that you're thinking of is one where a lot of people are doing well, but nobody is getting super crazy mega rich off of food.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that at all. I think, like Mariela was saying, there's not historically, or I think looking forward, a pathway to have the kind of agriculture that we, I think all on this call want to have and that your audience wants to have, and also have those people be millionaires. I don't think that's the point, and I don't think that's the aspiration of what we do or of what people who go into land stewardship do it for. But I think there is a responsibility that we have as a society to ensure that people in whatever sector it might be, in this case we're talking about agriculture in particular, and I think there is a special role of the people who produce the food that we all eat to ensure that they are able to have a reasonable livelihood both during their kind of working years and after. And we haven't solved that at all in any real way, particularly the after and that after happens usually a lot younger of an age, or should happen at the younger.
What do you mean?
People are using their bodies, is what I mean to say.
And they're wearing their bodies down. The average lifespan of a strawberry farm worker in California is 49 years old. So there is a responsibility that I think we all have, and part of what drives, I think, the broader reason that I think both of us probably do this work is to create a society where that's valued. And I think there's a financial component to that, but I think it's more than just a financial component. I think it's a really rich area for us to keep working on, is to, de-commodifying land doesn't necessarily solve for retirement for farmers. So that's still a broader, I think, conversation about what does a social safety net look like that works for people who are in agriculture or in other sectors where we don't have a pension plan system set up to support people after they're done working, let alone a succession plan for what happens to that farm or ranch or whatever it is after one generation. But I do think that land decommodification, I'd add a third, maybe or fourth, to the spectrum that Mariela shared earlier of where land is purchased or received but removed from the marketplace. I think that's another key component for decommodification to me, is that it does not return back to the marketplace as a commodity which is bought and sold. It may be traded, it may be transferred, it may shift ownership, but it doesn't happen on the basis and within the constraints of a market-based economic system. Because as long as it does, the value appreciates, and this question of affordability will just carry forward with it. We'll pass it on to generations going forward. And so I think another aspect of decommodification is to remove land from the marketplace and hold it in structures that are accountable to the community that land is located in. And now I'm starting to talk about the concept of the commons, which is something that people might be familiar with. But I think that doesn't solve for these other questions for how to make rural livelihoods reasonable and livable and attractive to people, but it does, I think, take one big step towards that end and opens doors for deeper conversations about how to make these sectors more viable. Are you talking, at least in part, about land easements, conservation easements that take them out of development, so they have to stay agricultural land, and you might build a barn, but you can't build a subdivision, that kind of thing?
It's maybe one step further than conservation easements. Conservation easements remove that development potential, like you say, and there's associated financial value with that potential development that gets removed from the land. So going back to the Watsonville example that Mariela gave, there's a conservation easement on that property that reduced the price by $1 million. But that $10 million or $11 million property that remains is still subject to the marketplace environment around it. So as development of Watsonville, Santa Cruz, et cetera, grows into that area, that land, because it's valued by its development potential, even though the development could never happen, that value is going to increase over time. And it's going to increase slower and it's going to increase less, but it's still going to increase. And what I mean by removing land from the marketplace is by purchasing it, and then the ownership, whatever entity it might be, places a restriction on itself, on its own ability to then sell that land at market value and holds it. So this is the concept of community land trusts as the sort of like most well-known example of land that is sort of taken off the marketplace. That's what they do.
So going through the things that you've been talking about, we're talking about community land trusts, we're talking about conservation easements, we're talking about returning land to Indigenous tribal people, public land and private land. There's philanthropic grants that are not paid back. There's low or no return investments. There's worker-owned farms, which I think you're talking about, and collective land ownership. Does that kind of cover the different things you're doing? What have we missed? I know some part of the work is also about things like saving and sharing seeds and stuff like that. But what else have we not talked about?
That's a lot. Yeah. I think what I would add to that, maybe not add, but maybe share some context about why it feels like so big and so broad, is that, part of what I think our collective work is to test new models, to work towards de-commodifying land, to work towards having farmers have livelihoods that sustain them, all the things that have come up right now. And so we're trying things to see like how it can work. And it looks different because every deal looks different. Mary Charlotte, like I think, one of the really interesting pieces for me for this, like even just this last year, has been all the ways that land is held, all the ways that land can be taken off the market, and all the types of different entity structures, projects, people, tribes that could hold this land and steward this land for us. And so I think it's hard to say like this is the specific path from one to the other, because we haven't had a fundamental shift in a system where we're all working towards changing it from one space to the other, which means that we're working in an ecosystem that isn't ideal and then trying to get it out of the other. So just to say like, yes, it's all those things. And what happens on the land looks different for tribal communities, for folks I've been working with that are doing seed saving, for folks that are doing commercial but sustainable agriculture. And then also there's two things I want to share. One is that I think we talk a lot about this in the sense of collective interest and like public good and things that from a values perspective we should be aligned in. But also there's just like a private interest in these things happening. Like I thought about this a lot in COVID and our access to like food and produce and how dependent our system is on food that comes externally, that's coming through like giant distributors and all these things, and how easy it was because I, as a person, have connections to farmers and folks who are thinking about CSAs and these kinds of things, like for me to go access the food that I needed in this time. And the reason that happens is because we have farmers who are stewarding land, growing food for us. And the way that that will sustain is that we also secure land tenure for them. So even beyond kind of a larger philosophical conversation of de-commodifying land, just like having farmers have secure land so that they can grow food for themselves and for us is such like a basic thing that we need to think about from a private interest, and that we're having these like big disasters happen that should remind us that it is a personal and individual interest for us to have these ecosystems, right? For folks who can't think in kind of the communal, I just like wanted to share that because I think it's important in the timing that we have now. I think another thing also that I wanted to kind of share is that we have an ideal, which is this return to the land. And then we also have the reality that our current system, and I would say maybe especially American philanthropy, is a product of capitalism. And so our brain is often wired to think of things based on return, based on value, based on like what's going to get us to be zillionaires, because that's kind of the culture that we're in. And I think part of the invitation that I would share with folks that are maybe more on the investment philanthropy side who want to see these things happen is that this work is kind of rooted in understanding that we're not looking for opportunities that yield the highest reserve or preserve wealth for folks who are super wealthy, but really about ways to support folks who are most impacted. And inevitably, that's people who are producing our food. And what does that mean to collectively steward things for our collective benefit? So anyways, I think one of the things that I want to make sure that we touch upon is like, there's an ideal of land back and there's a reality of where the money's coming from, which is unideal right now. And just like a call to action for folks to continue to think about how they align their values with this kind of work. That's the only thing that's missing for me.
Well, and the reality is, I mean, the kind of subtext of this conversation is really massive redistribution of wealth.
Exactly.
Really not having this class of very few people and very large amounts of wealth at the top, and then this other class of very, very little wealth and very large numbers of people at the bottom. And that in a context where so much of the food production is controlled by a small number of conglomerates, and those conglomerates are doing so much of the land and water degradation in the first place, and the inhumane treatment of people and animals and pollution and so on and so on. I mean, the task is daunting, and in a way, I can't help but thinking the work you're doing is kind of providing an example of what we could do when that whole big system just implodes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely working away from that system intentionally. Yeah, I mean, I think we want folks to reckon with the fact that wealth, like how wealth was created in this country, and that it's not individual, like even the folks who are zillionaires, like it's not their wealth. It's not their wealth. And I think that's a hard part that folks have a hard time detaching themselves from. And that we are working towards a system that is actively and purposefully looking to redistribute wealth and also redistribute power and decision-making over our collective wealth.
Exactly.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to add is I think part of what makes this conversation might sound like a little meandering or squishy is also we're challenging, I think, and trying to figure out how to talk about things outside of a binary. That's the most comfortable way to try to talk about things. So it's either private or public. It's either charitable or profitable. It's either commercial or nonprofit. And where we're occupying space is to try to find something that actually inhabits in both and takes some features of one and some features of the other, the ones that are serving people's needs and community well-being from each of those, and then trying to give it a name or trying to create something that represents both of those that doesn't yet have, it's not a household term yet to talk about cooperatives. It's not a household term to talk about land trusts or to talk about non-extractive investing. But these are just attempts to try to give words to this alternative pathway that recognizes that we do engage in economic activity with each other, but it has to serve our needs rather than serve the interests of those that control the levers of that system. So I encourage people to be willing to just try to engage with that portion of it and kind of stretch our brains. The easiest thing, I think, and the most disheartening thing is for people to receive it and then under the veil of impracticality dismiss it and label it with idealism or label it with something that sort of creates this sense of impossibility. I encourage people to sort of like have that reaction, put it to the side for a second, try to engage with it and wrestle with it a bit, and then bring back that feeling of like, okay, well, maybe this doesn't feel like it applies to me right now, but at least I'm curious about this one pathway. I'm going to like look into it more for people who aren't yet sort of used to engaging it, and just start to like build some of that muscle memory.
Especially since the current system is fundamentally unsustainable, which means that it will end. So when it ends, what are we going to do? And how can we soften that ending and make the transition before we have a total catastrophe? There's not an infinite amount of harvesting you can do from soil that, for all intents and purposes, is dead. There's not an infinite amount of water that you can take out of aquifers without doing proper stewardship so the aquifers are recharged. And all these are ultimately factors that have to be thought about when you're having this conversation. So anyway, Neil, Thapar, and Mariela Cedeño, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
You can find out more about Neil Thapar's work at weareminnow.org. You can find out more about Mariela Cedeño at manzanitacapital.co. And the People's Land Fund is at peopleslandfund.org. You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also, please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.